No! Damn it!
Damn
Stop! This scares me sometimes.
What?
Because you're rough.
Listen, roughness is everything. It's more funner than casual sex. That's just boring as
Oh, God. You're hurting me. Okay, stop.
Orlando, please come on this line for recorded. How can I help you?
I just talked to my nephew, and he said that when the neighbor came down and was fighting with his girlfriend, beating her up, and he was trying to get him off from her, they knocked him out. And he said she was shot, and he shot also.
Okay, so is she, where is she then, if she...
She said she was in the bedroom floor. Oh, my God, somebody please.
Police arrived at the Orlando apartment of 23-year-old Ryan Doyle and found the body of his girlfriend, 25-year-old Laura Fisher, dead from multiple gunshot wounds. Doyle was nowhere to be found. Investigators located Doyle hours later in an emergency room more than 500 miles away in North Carolina with gunshot wounds to his shoulder.
Talk to you about what's going on, but I also want to let you know that you're under no obligation to talk to me. You're free to go at any time.
Honestly, I'd rather we wouldn't talk about it.
Well, I would prefer you to, but I just want you to.
Everything helps.
Well, good.
At this point in the investigation, they are aware that the suspect's girlfriend has been found dead in his apartment, and he has fled the scene of the crime. Doyle doesn't do what the rest of us would do. He doesn't call 911, he doesn't try and revive her, he doesn't call for help or scream for help with any of the neighbors. He packs his stuff and he leaves.
All right, Ron, where do you live?
Orlando, Florida. I'm originally from Kentucky, though.
What did you move down there for?
I had my mind set on college, so tried to go get a job. I was drawing unemployment for a bit, because I got laid off from my other job.
He's difficult to engage with. He might be intentionally trying to manipulate the situation by being so flat and not sharing any vulnerabilities or information. Individuals who are psychopaths tend to have this very flat affect. They don't respond to the typical emotions like you or I might.
So you're about out of money?
Pretty much. Well, my money ain't made a deal anyway. She said she was gonna do this.
One of the markers of a psychopathic lifestyle is not being able to hold a job, not being able to have relationships, being manipulative and irresponsible. Here we have a little sort of taste of that. It's not really clear if he's going to school, but he's borrowing money, relying on his aunt. He's drawing from someone else, but he's not doing anything with it.
Are you into any drugs or anything down there?
I quit drinking for about 8 months. The other night was actually the first time I drank within 8 months. Alcohol's been my biggest weakness.
Okay.
I've been drinking on and off since I was 9.
Doyle's telling us that he's been clean and sober for 8 months, but what we know from the record is that's not entirely accurate. There's a history of drug use. We also know, based on neighbors' accounts, that he was on again, off again using alcohol. And when you already have an individual who struggles with impulsivity, and then you increase that impulsivity with drug and alcohol abuse, you essentially have a powder keg for some pretty negative behavior.
Saturday night, the boys ended up having one of my food drinks.
Right. So, you and your friends?
Me and my lady, and someone I thought was friends of mine, lived upstairs. His first name's Darren.
Okay.
I mean, everybody around there calls him D. They disrespect me. And so me and him got in a fight. They acting like a little gangster deal. I don't get in everybody's face. They got a little road bitch. Hit her right across the face. I ended up hitting 10 times right by the head. I knew when I broke my nose. I got every one pop. He left.
Someone with psychopathic traits may talk about very violent, repulsive behavior as if they're going to the store to buy a jug of milk, with really no outward expression of their emotion.
So after she wanted to have sex. She was bought a sex bondage kit.
Did she?
Yeah, I told you. She tied me down, then I tied her down. We just used it that way. And then her door. I was trying to step backwards to cover her. I was trying to protect her. He ended up shooting me in the shoulder. I don't know where he was aiming at.
Doyle wants this female detective specifically to believe that he's the chivalrous man who's trying to protect his old lady, and Darren was aggressive, he was the perpetrator. He's trying to get her to believe he's this good guy who would protect women. We know that that's just farther from the truth.
Hold on just a second. So you're trying to keep him at the door, and then he shoots you, and that's the last thing you remember?
I black out and I pass out. When I wake up next morning, Lord, had blood coming out of her mouth. Got images going through my head, and images waking up to a person that's fully cold, no body heat running through, and blood everywhere.
He wakes up and the woman that he has claimed as his girlfriend is covered in blood, and he is not particularly bothered by that. He's more bothered by how he has suffered. The indifference to the suffering of his girlfriend feels very much like a marker of psychopathy.
Did Ryan punch you in the face?
No, I don't remember that.
Did you hit him?
No.
Ryan's telling us that you shot him.
What? I shot him? Man, come on. No, I haven't shot anybody. I can take a lie detector test. I haven't shot no gun at all. We got in a scuffle, me and Tommy. And then after that, we left and went upstairs.
Do you know why you're in a sheriff's department?
Honestly, I know it's overworked there. I got killed and I got shot. That's what I mean, I just told you the truth about it. I have no reason why.
Doyle is really distancing himself from his girlfriend, now referring to her as that girl. And he almost preemptively provides a, don't worry, I'm not lying, I'm telling you the truth. I think that that's his attempt to hopefully stop her from asking any other questions or doubting him in any way.
All right.
More irritated and stuff.
Ryan's had his childhood was not very good. Right.
Been abused, sexually abused, physically abused. I took him when he was like 10 or 11 and kept him for 7 years. His mom threw him down.
As Doyle's aunt is being called in to the interrogation, his body language changes. He goes from being open and somewhat comfortable, relaxed, laid back, to he's now pulled his body parts together. He's crunched together almost in a somewhat fetal position. He's not in control anymore. Individuals who are psychopathic like to maintain a sense of control when they're dealing with the authorities. Now it's going to get uncomfortable because he has a mother figure in the room, trying to be his moral compass.
Can you step out and let me talk to him for a minute and then have you come back in? Is that what you want? You want me to do that? You think I'm stupid?
Didn't say you was.
No, look me in the eye. Do you think I'm stupid?
No.
You're going to stand here and you're going to tell me the truth, man. And
I
I'm
am telling the truth about it.
I'm going to tell me the truth. You don't want me to.
I don't remember. I blacked out. I don't remember shooting.
He says to his aunt, I don't remember shooting her. This is quite a shift from the entire rest of the interview where he's basically said, Dee came in. Dee shot her. Oh, and shot me, by the way. But now, unsolicited to his aunt, he says, I don't remember shooting her. Almost as if he's taking responsibility for what he's saying. He doesn't remember it.
He has feelings for his aunt and doesn't want to disappoint her. She clearly is familiar with his rages, his drinking, his episodes, his fights. And perhaps Doyle thinks that she's gonna she's gonna bail him out of trouble. And despite all the other things happening, the lack of remorse, the shallowness, the glibness, a part of him is more human when she's in the room. And that part that's more human is not able to lie in the complete way he can to a stranger.
I'm not doubting she's blacked out.
Mixing all the alcohol together. Dealing with my temper. With Dee running his
Don't cuss.
mouth. I went into shutdown. I remember bits and pieces.
If you did something, then you need to man up and have the guts enough to state it.
I've been trying to play back through my memory. Because when I black out, it's hard for me to remember.
We've helped you all your life. Right now is the time to help yourself, please. I am begging you.
Where did you get rid of the gun?
Over somewhere else around somewhere. I don't know what road I was on.
He's now willing to say he committed the crime, but the detective knows that he knows more details than he's telling them. Doyle doesn't want to say these things in front of his aunt because now the impression management has switched to the aunt. He doesn't want this one and only person who has protected him his whole life, taken him in every time he's failed and he's messed up, to think less of him as a person.
Everything wrong, please?
It's not going to be easy for you to tell me that you lied. No. I know it would have been harder for you to say it than her. Everybody lies.
I do. Yeah, we lived together about a month. I actually cared about her.
What happened that got out of hand? Did y'all start arguing?
I knew I hurt myself on God. Because it makes an extinct noise. She had in the living room going through it. She got pissed off because of them pictures. But me being already in a blackout stage, everybody knows that been around me a while. I've already hit the blackout stage just looking at my team.
He's saying if she had just left me alone, this wouldn't have happened. And that is squarely the kind of behavior that we see with psychopathic individuals, is this inability to take responsibility for their own violence and aggression and the harm they cause others. And what we know about psychopathic individuals is that they don't typically like to be challenged, and that may have been what kicked off the violence.
Oh, damn it.
Damn
Stop. It scares me sometimes.
What?
Because you're rough.
I am not.
Yes, you are.
Investigators were going through his phone. They found hundreds of photographs and video recordings of women in quite explicit sexual positions. And what's so disturbing, what's so upsetting, are the women sort of saying, wait, stop, or don't appear to know that they're being recorded. Doyle appears to be a sexual psychopath, really dominant, aggressive, and enjoying hurting women.
Listen, roughness is everything. It's more funner than casual sex. That's just boring as
Oh, God. You're hurting me. Okay, stop.
Oh, poor thing. She wants you to cry.
I never hit her. She pushed me. And then we ended up in the bedroom. I don't remember shooting her. I remember hearing recoil. That's all I remember.
What did she say that made you so mad?
I remember something coming out her mouth about my brother. I've got a rule about him. Mess with my brother, say something about him, just messing with my period. So I raised him the first 4 years of his life. He looks at me as a father. I look at him as a son. She said it's almost like it's better off that I don't move around him because of my temper or I drink. Pissed me off.
Where was she when you shot her?
On my bed, her head ended up being right here.
Individuals with psychopathic traits have a difficult time reining in their rage. And pair that with their lack of remorse and their callousness for hurting other people, they lash out without really even thinking about what it means for the other individual. They also have this grandiose sense of who they are and what they've accomplished. How dare she question him and the way he wants to spend time with his brother? She should have known better in his perception.
Where were you when you shot yourself, though? Are you still in Florida?
At the beginning of North Carolina. Right at the borderline. I twisted my arm or something like.
He's a messy and disorganized, impulsive killer. So he does go to great lengths to try to help himself, but he's not very good at covering up the murder scene, and so he shoots himself to sort of bolster the story that somebody invaded the house and shot him. The way he's trying to avoid blame is by making himself into a hero and a victim at the same time. He may regret that he was caught, but he certainly doesn't feel guilty that this woman is dead, this young woman who has 2 children.
that night you're supposed to went to school and you skipped school.
I miss school all the time. I hid it pretty well.
That's the thing, you're not supposed to do stuff like that.
Well, I was going to tell you. No, it wasn't.
Early this morning, first responders answered a desperate 911 call from Albie's trailer park. Before the caller could identify himself, the line fell silent. When investigators arrived, they searched the trailer park before finally locating him. But it was too late. 40-year-old Randy Tomjack was found stabbed to death inside his home.
All I know is my first name, Danny. That's all. I sat down here for quite a while. That little room there. All those reactions in there. Shutting it out. I can understand that. Now, after hearing that your best friend's not there anymore, and the guy that you're buying a house from, and then being locked up like a prisoner, I can understand that.
Ball's starting this interview off with impression management from Go. He's brought in for questioning, and his response is he tries to take off. Most law enforcement have a perspective that innocent people don't run. Essentially what he's addressing with the detective, that he's sorry he had that reaction. He realizes that wasn't the right thing to do. But I think what Ball's really doing is realizing that really made him look quite guilty.
I grew up out here. Started out at Overland, Kansas. Oh, until I was 10 years old. I'd like to get there. Okay, that way.
When looking at this case, one of the things that stands out about Ball is his own narcissism. He's somewhat entitled. The reaction most of us would have to finding out that a close friend had just been violently killed would not be that this is an inconvenience for me.
Let's start at 10 o'clock last night. 10 o'clock last night, I was on my second can of on Milwaukee's best light. I was over at my trailer house. I'm buying the place for rain. Now I hear the rain stop. What is it for? Now, you and Randy are buddies, aren't you? Pretty much. Oh, there's days where I lock the door and hide in the bedroom. Sure. Knocks on the door, like I did at night. He came over tonight. But I ignored the door and turned off the TV and the sound and everything, so he'd go away. When do you come over, just to normally just here or what? Normally Randy just comes over to when he comes over, I just half the time I need to think of the stories. The night before last night, talked about his job and everything, bragging up how good it was going. Last night I didn't let him. He left. And then I realized I was out of cigarettes, and I said, well, I'll run over to Randy's. Even though I didn't answer the door, I didn't like him and say that I was out. See if I'll bum me a couple of cigarettes.
First of all, he's saying that he's a friend of Randy, but he actually shuts him out and locks the door and ignores him half of the time. So the only time he really wants Randy is when he wants something. So what I see here is someone who's manipulative, sort of parasitic, just using someone when they need them.
This willingness to use people however you need to and dispose of them when you don't. It's transactional. That's really a marker of psychopathic behavior.
What did you think? I thought Randy was innocent. Really? Okay. Why did you think that? Because he's been gambling too. Oh, has he? I thought maybe one took his kid from busted his legs or something.
He says he thinks that his best friend killed himself, and he's laughing about it. There's no grief there. There's no sadness there. Then he goes so far as to throw the victim under the bus and tell all his dirty deeds, that he's now gambling. The motivation behind it really seems to be more about humiliating the victim.
He really believes that he's going to get away with it. This is very classically psychopathic, feeling superior, feeling grandiose, and enjoying your own contempt because it makes you feel powerful. He does not think that there's any proof to link him to the murder.
Last night, what happened between you and he? I need you to be honest, Danny. I am being honest. I wasn't at Randy's trailer except for when I went over there to buy me some cigarettes. But when I got near the influences and stuff were already there. I want you to tell me the truth. I am telling way that we can clear this mess up. Detective, you're calling me a liar right now. Why is there blood in your pickup? Why is there blood in my pickup? Is there blood in my picture? Mm-hmm. Or are you making up a story?
Ball is stalling instead of answering, yes, there's blood in my truck, or no, there isn't. He just flips the narrative on the detective, and he's doing something that is a strategic and manipulative technique. It's a tactic. It's consistent with somebody who is failing to take any responsibility.
Here we have somebody who's obviously being questioned about a murder. Even if you didn't do anything, you would typically respond with a little more deference than what we're seeing Ball respond with. And he is actually coming as very grandiose, trying to turn the questioning around on the investigator.
Do I have blood on my face? Do I have blood on my body? Do I have blood on my hands? You're making a story too, to try to trap me. No, I'm not. On the seatbelt. In the ignition. Why is that there? When we send that to the lab, is that going to come back? That it's Randy's blood? You just have to send it to the lab and find out. As far as I know right now, you're trying to trap me into something. Okay, how about you answer my question of how that blood would have gotten there? How about you start being truthful with me?
On first glance, this argument and interaction with the detective, you might think Ball is being childish, but it actually adds to his risk level because the confidence and brazen behavior that he's showing is somebody who's willing to assert control and authority in a very impulsive way. He's not thinking about the consequences.
I'm going to ask you about some statements that you made, okay? And I want you to tell me why you would have said them. You said to deputy that I didn't want him to die. When? You said that this morning to the deputy. That's so now the deputy's a liar. Either a liar or a misphraser. Dead or alive, he's my friend.
This whole interaction to me felt like Ball was losing his balance. And he got a little bit scared because he's starting to feel cornered. And so he's speaking impulsively. He doesn't understand the nature of the question. He's trying to figure out why I didn't want him to die, why that's important.
Through all of this, what we don't actually see is any sincere remorse. You see no real emotion, you see no sadness, you see no guilt over any aspect of, my friend died.
I think I'm gonna talk. You're being held under suspicion of murder, Danny. Okay. Stand up, Jen. Bring you back. You're going back to yourself. Okay, I understand it. You told the jailer that you wanted her to talk to you. Okay. I'm here to listen to you. Okay, buddy? You're right. I'm right about what? There's blood on the back door in Rainey's trailer. Okay. How did that blood get? Oh.
What it does seem like is he's had time to think in his cell that the evidence is so overwhelmingly against him that maybe he can salvage his circumstances if he chooses to give them what they want. So what we're really still seeing here is a manipulative tactic. It's a strategy to try and gain an advantage. And to mistake it for real empathy or regret or remorse is to be duped.
Okay, let's start. You and Randy first got together last night. I just lost. I'd been dwelling over everything that happened all summer long about how much I'd had the extra work to cover up there. And that lazy piece of our buddies. Our buddies? He thought we okay. I just think. Hey, how did you get the blood all over? After getting drunk, I just ended up getting up and going over there, stabbing him. Did you guys argue about something, or? Not arguing or anything. I just got pissed off over what happened the last summer and all that was going on. I had applied over at Benny's for a job in the summertime. Then he never even called me back, and then all of a sudden, here Rain comes and he gets the job. And that lazy piece of the stress and the strain on my back, my legs, and everything else like that, just trying to cover his.
So they worked together, and then this other job came up, but he didn't get it, and Randy did. And so he seems to have, become intensely envious, jealous, outraged. He took it as a huge insult, and he felt that he didn't get the job, even though he was superior. This is the narcissistic part of psychopathy. I am so great. Why was I ignored? I am better than you. Why was I discarded? And this path from anger to envy to jealousy to revenge is very much part of a psychopathic trajectory of anger.
So did you knock on the door, he invited you in, or just walk me through, Danny, so that like I said, so I can hear your side, okay? Instead of waking him up, I slipped in that back door of the bedroom. Were there any lights on in the trailer? There was enough light to see by, so at least the TV was on. It was by the door or on the couch. Okay, did you guys have any type of conversation? Like you said, what the hell are you doing here? Or, hey, it's good to see you? No. As far as I know, I just planted a knife and took off. Did you poke him a couple of times, one time, a lot of times? All I remember is after I planted the knife, he said my name.
It's interesting he uses language like, well, I planted the knife rather than I stabbed him. I mean, that language strikes me as his way of softening, manipulating his role in the way that it comes across in the interview.
So did you take the knife over with you, or was it from his house, or took it over with a big pocket knife, a kitchen knife? I couldn't even tell you. All I know is I was laying in the cell, and all of a sudden it started. I was black.
Blackout states don't work the way Ball is describing the memories he has and the memories he doesn't have. One of the things that Ball may have been doing was starting to set up a situation where he wasn't going to be culpable for the murder itself. But this was very much premeditated. It was calculated to enter the victim's home at night, knowing that the victim was sleeping, where the victim had little to no chance to fight back. He didn't even see him coming.
Ball strikes me as someone who's using the blackout explanation as an excuse, basically as a way to get out of telling what really happened. It is true that when people are engaged in a traumatic act, even hurting someone else, they can have dissociation or, feel as if they're blacking out from the experience. But there's other indications that, in fact, he did know what was going on. The selective memory, I don't really know where I got the knife from. I don't know what kind of knife it is. I blacked out. I mean, nothing about him telling this strikes me as believable. It all seems manipulative. To me, it seems like another unsophisticated attempt to avoid responsibility.
The Bible says, if you confess, that you might be. You religious man, Danny? Not really. It's all like pictures, but right. He wasn't stabbed in the head. When you got home, what did you do? Shower. Going off blackout, just take pictures of the stove. What did you do with your clothes before you got in the shower?
It doesn't quite make sense to say he doesn't remember the knife when he picked it up. And he's able to dispose of certain things and he remembers some pieces of evidence, so he's not forensically smart about how to describe the blackout. And I think that's what gives him a little bit away. It's the manner of the blackout that he's describing doesn't ring true.
He did stab him 59 times according to the autopsy, which would suggest that he was in a fit of rage at that moment. The entire murder doesn't seem impulsive at all. He, was able to plan enough to get a weapon, bring a knife in, make sure he attacked the victim in the middle of the night whenever he was asleep, and had the forethought to also put his clothes, or evidence, basically, in the fireplace so that he could destroy it. It seems like it was something that was calculated.
Hey, you had a mask on? Yeah. Okay, what kind of mask? Oh, the mask.
The irony of choice of masks that Ball selects, the Grim Reaper, the Angel of Death, really speaks to this fantasy that he had going in his own head about what it would be like to kill someone, how it might make him powerful. Ball strikes me as somebody who spent most of his life being unremarkable. He hasn't accomplished a whole lot. He has been in and out of various institutions and facilities. Ultimately, the purpose of choosing the Grim Reaper may have been about Ball's own arrogance, his own narcissism, and his own ability to say, I am that important.
Then I went back later to see what kind of damage I caused. That's what the ambulance police were there. Okay.
So on the one hand, he's careful about masking, burning the clothes. On the other hand, he leaves fingerprints, traces of blood in Randy's trailer as well as in his car.
So this feels like he thought he could come back and just clean up the mess later and everything would be okay. The one thing he didn't expect was that Randy called 911. And he didn't expect that because he knew that he had stabbed Randy 59 times.
It seems like Ball is very much wanting to see what he's accomplished. Going back to the scene to see the mayhem and chaos, there's police officers there, there's a crime scene that's taped off, there's a crowd of people. And ultimately, Ball's quietly able to take pride in the fact that he did that. And while he says, I try not to do damage anymore, that's him talking about this impulse that he finally gave into on the night of the crime. And maybe this is something he had fantasized about for a while. He wanted to revel in it.
I'm asking you right now what you told me, so we don't have any confusion. After fuming for 3 or 4 months, in a drunken binge, on the snapped. Going over to Randy's house and stabbing him.
There are houses that become part of a town's memory because something beautiful happened inside them. A family was raised there. Children grew up there. Holidays were celebrated there. Neighbors came and went, and from the outside, the house became another quiet landmark in an ordinary community. But sometimes a house enters history for a very different reason. In Westfield, New Jersey, there once stood a large 19-room home known as Breeze Knoll. It was the kind of place that suggested stability, comfort, and respectability. It belonged to a family that, at least from the outside, appeared to occupy a familiar position in middle-class suburban life. Inside lived John Emil List, his wife Helen, his mother Alma, and his 3 children, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. In November 1971, that appearance of normality would collapse. 5 members of the family would be dead, and the man responsible would disappear. For nearly 18 years, John List would exist under another name, living a new life while the old one remained buried in the house he had left behind. His eventual capture would come not from a dramatic confrontation in the years immediately following the killings, but through a television program, an aging reconstruction of his face, and a viewer who recognized something familiar in a man who was supposed to have vanished. The story of John Emil List is therefore not simply the story of 5 murders. It is also the story of a family hidden behind an outward appearance of normality, of a man whose private fears became increasingly severe, and of a crime that was followed by one of the longest disappearances in modern American criminal history. To understand what happened at Breeze Knoll, it is necessary to begin with the man at the center of it. John Emil List was born on September 17, 1925, in Bay City, Michigan. He grew up in a Lutheran household shaped by strict religious beliefs and strong ideas about responsibility and the role of a man within a family. As an adult, List worked in accounting and finance. To people around him, he did not resemble the conventional image of a dangerous criminal. He was described as quiet, orderly, and rigid in his principles. He attended church, taught Sunday school, and participated in scouting activities. There was nothing in that public image that immediately suggested what would eventually happen. Inside his home, his family consisted of 5 other people. His wife, Helen List, lived with him at Breeze Knoll. His mother, Alma List, was 84 years old. His daughter Patricia was 16. His son John Jr. was 15. His younger son Frederick was 13. They lived together in the 19-room house in Westfield, a quiet New Jersey community near New York. The size of the home and its outward appearance contributed to the impression of a family that was doing well. But beneath that appearance, serious problems were developing. By 1971, the List family's financial situation had become deeply troubled. The house carried a large mortgage. John's employment situation had deteriorated. He had also used money from his mother's savings in an attempt to deal with the family's financial difficulties. The possibility of losing the house became increasingly real. Yet the most important detail was not simply that List was experiencing financial problems. It was that he did not tell his family how serious the situation had become. He continued to maintain the appearance that he was going to work normally, even as the reality of his circumstances became more difficult. Later, during the legal proceedings, a psychiatrist described List as someone who was deeply preoccupied with his responsibility to protect his family and particularly sensitive to failure. These details would become important because the killings did not emerge simply as an immediate, uncontrolled reaction to one sudden event. The evidence presented later showed preparation, but money was not the only issue. Religion also played an important role in the explanation of List's thinking. He had been raised within a strict Lutheran environment, and he became increasingly concerned that his children were moving away from the religious standards he considered important. In his own reasoning, financial failure and the family's spiritual direction became connected. A 5-page letter that List left for his pastor would later become one of the important pieces of evidence in understanding how he explained his actions. In that letter, he connected the family's financial difficulties with what he saw as a decline in faith. The conclusion he reached was profoundly distorted. Instead of seeing his family members as individuals with their own lives and choices, List came to believe that he could make the ultimate decision on their behalf. The idea that death could somehow represent a form of protection or rescue became part of the justification he constructed for what he was about to do. That distinction matters. John List did not simply attack his family in a moment of anger and then immediately flee. In the days surrounding the crime, he took steps that showed he had considered what would happen after the killings. He told the children's school that they would be absent. He arranged circumstances that could make it appear that the family was away. He stopped newspaper and milk deliveries. He dealt with bills and financial matters. He left messages. He lowered the temperature inside the house in an effort to slow the decomposition of the bodies. And he wrote the 5-page letter to his pastor. Each action would later become part of the prosecution's argument that the murders were deliberate and carefully prepared. There is something particularly disturbing about that preparation because it reveals that the crime was not limited to the moment when the guns were fired. List was thinking about the hours and days afterward. He was thinking about what other people might believe. He was thinking about money, appearances, and the discovery of the bodies. And he was thinking about how he would leave. On November 9, 1971, John Emil List carried out the plan. 5 members of his own family would die: his wife Helen, his 84-year-old mother Alma, his 16-year-old daughter Patricia, his 15-year-old son John Jr., and his 13-year-old son Frederick. List used handguns, including a 9mm and a .22. The details surrounding each victim were later presented during the investigation and trial. But the central fact remains stark. 5 people who lived together in the same family home were killed by the man who was supposed to be part of their protection and security. John Jr., 15 years old, was singled out in the prosecution's presentation because he was shot multiple times, in circumstances believed to have involved a reaction or an attempt to resist his father. The killings left the family home transformed. Yet even after the 5 people were dead, List did not simply run from the house. He continued to carry out ordinary-looking tasks. Evidence presented later showed that he went to a bank and dealt with financial matters. He then arranged the bodies inside Breeze Knoll, for were placed on sleeping bags in the ballroom. Alma, his 84-year-old mother, remained on the 3rd floor because List could not move her. The 5-page letter to his pastor was left behind. Then John List disappeared. The following day, November 10th, his car was found near Kennedy Airport in New York. Investigators believed he had left the area by public transportation. From that point forward, the man known as John Emil List seemed to disappear from the life he had created. But he had not disappeared from the world. He would eventually take another name, build another life, attend another church, work, form new relationships, and marry again. For almost 18 years, the question would remain, where was John List? The answer would eventually come through a television screen. But before that happened, the silence inside Breeze Knoll had to be broken, and the lives of 5 victims had to be reconstructed from the evidence left behind. The investigation would become a search not only for a missing man, but for the identity of someone who had successfully hidden himself in plain sight. And somewhere beyond New Jersey, under another name, John Emil List was already beginning that new life. Before John Emil List became the subject of a nationwide search, before his name appeared on television, and before the face of an aging fugitive was reconstructed for millions of viewers, there were 5 people whose lives had little to do with the man they would eventually be remembered alongside. Helen List was a wife. Alma List was an 84-year-old mother. Patricia List was a 16-year-old daughter. John List Jr. was 15. Frederick List was 13. They were not simply names in a criminal case. They were a family living together inside a 19-room house in Westfield, New Jersey, a place that from the outside suggested stability and security. To understand the tragedy at Breeze Knoll, it is important to begin with them, because the crime was not committed against strangers. It happened within a household, between people who shared the same home and whose lives had been connected long before November 1971. Helen List was John List's wife. She lived with him and their 3 children at Breeze Knoll. The available details about her life are limited in the information surrounding the case. But one fact is central. She became one of the 5 people killed by her husband on November 9, 1971. Her death was part of a crime that List had prepared for in advance. She was not an accidental victim caught in a sudden confrontation. She was one of the members of the family whom List had decided he could determine the fate of. Alma List, John's mother, was 84 years old and also lived in the house. Her presence was significant in another way because List had used money from her savings while attempting to deal with the family's financial difficulties. The family's financial situation had become increasingly troubled, and the house carried a large mortgage. List's employment situation had also become difficult. Yet he did not tell his family how serious the problems had become. Alma's age made her the oldest member of the household, and when List later arranged the bodies after the killings, he could not move her body from the 3rd floor. That detail would become part of the physical evidence of what had happened inside Breeze Knoll. Patricia List was 16 years old. She was one of John and Helen's 3 children and one of the young lives that ended inside the family home. Her age is important because the crime was not simply the destruction of an adult household. 2 of the victims were teenagers, and Frederick, the youngest, was only 13. John List Jr. was 15. During the trial, prosecutors gave particular attention to the circumstances surrounding his death. According to the prosecution's presentation, John Jr. was shot multiple times, in circumstances believed to have involved a reaction or an attempt to resist his father. That detail stands apart from the other accounts because it suggests that the teenager may have reacted to what was happening rather than simply accepting it. But the available information does not provide a complete reconstruction of his final moments. And it is important not to turn an uncertain detail into a fictional scene. What can be stated with certainty from the case material is that John Jr. was one of 5 members of the List family killed on November 9, 1971. Frederick List was 13 years old, the youngest of the 3 children. Like his brother and sister, he lived at Breeze Knoll with his parents and grandmother. His death completed the destruction of the immediate family. 5 people who shared one home were gone, and the person responsible was the head of that household. That fact would remain at the heart of the case long after the bodies were discovered and long after John List had disappeared. The setting itself added another layer to the tragedy. Breeze Knoll was a 19-room home in Westfield, New Jersey, a quiet suburban community near New York. Its size and appearance suggested a family that had achieved a degree of comfort. From the outside, there was no obvious indication that the household was approaching catastrophe. Yet the financial circumstances inside the home were increasingly unstable. List faced serious financial problems. The mortgage on the house was large, his work situation had deteriorated, and he had already used money from his mother's savings to help manage the difficulties. The possibility of losing the house became a source of intense concern. For List, financial failure was not simply an economic problem. The later psychiatric testimony described him as deeply preoccupied with the responsibility of protecting his family and particularly sensitive to failure. That interpretation became important because List's own understanding of his role within the family was central to the prosecution and defense arguments. He had grown up in a strict Lutheran environment, and religion remained an important part of the way he understood responsibility. He attended church, taught Sunday school, and participated in scouting activities. He was not presented as someone who had openly rejected his religious background. Instead, his religious beliefs became part of the distorted reasoning he later used to explain what he had done. List was increasingly concerned that his children were moving away from the religious standards he believed they should follow. The problem, as he understood it, was therefore larger than money. Financial failure threatened the material stability of the household, while what he regarded as a decline in religious faith threatened its spiritual stability. In his mind, these concerns became connected. The 5-page letter he left for his pastor would later provide an important window into that reasoning. In it, List connected the family's financial difficulties with the decline in faith he believed he saw within the household. The conclusion he reached was deeply distorted, rather than recognizing his wife, mother, and children as individuals entitled to make their own choices and live their own lives. He convinced himself that he could decide what was best for them. The information available about the case does not justify presenting that belief as an objective explanation or as evidence that the victims were somehow in danger from the problems he described. It was List's own justification for an act of violence that destroyed 5 lives. This distinction is crucial. The financial problems were real. His concerns about religion were part of his thinking, but neither circumstance explains away the killings. They only help establish the context in which List constructed his justification. And there was another important difference between a moment of emotional collapse and what happened at Breeze Knoll. Preparation. Before November 9th, List had already taken steps designed to control what would happen after his family was dead. He told the children's school they would be absent. He arranged circumstances that could make it appear that the family was away. He stopped newspaper and milk deliveries. He dealt with bills and financial matters. He left messages. He lowered the temperature inside the house to slow decomposition. And he wrote the letter to his pastor. These were not details discovered in isolation. Together, they became part of the evidence used by prosecutors to argue that List had planned the killings. The preparation also explains why the case would later become a question of legal responsibility, rather than simply identity. Once List was captured, there would be little doubt about who had committed the murders. The central dispute would become whether the man who planned the killings understood what he was doing and whether his mental state affected his criminal responsibility. But before that question could reach a courtroom, investigators first had to find him. And finding him would prove extraordinarily difficult. On November 9th, 1971, the List family effectively disappeared from the world. 5 lives ended inside the home. John List remained alive. The next day, his car was found near Kennedy Airport in New York, suggesting that he had left the area by public transportation. From that point onward, the family tragedy became a missing man investigation. The victims remained behind, but the person responsible was gone. What followed would be almost 18 years in which John List lived under another identity. For the people searching for him, the problem was not only that he had fled, it was that he had taken his name with him. The investigation would have to find a man who was no longer living as John Emil List. And while investigators searched for that missing identity, The people he had killed could never leave the place where their lives had ended. November 9th, 1971 began with a family that, on the surface, still appeared to have the ordinary structure of family life. Breeze Knoll stood in Westfield, New Jersey, a large 19-room house where John Emil List lived with his wife Helen, his 84-year-old mother Alma, and his 3 children, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. But beneath that appearance, the circumstances had already changed. John List was facing serious financial difficulties. His work situation had deteriorated. The house carried a large mortgage, and money from his mother's savings had already been used to deal with the family's problems. He had not told his family how serious the situation had become. At the same time, his concerns about religion and what he regarded as his children's movement away from the family's religious standards had become part of his thinking. These pressures did not excuse what followed. They only formed the background against which List made the decision to destroy his own household. What happened next was not simply an impulsive outburst. In the period surrounding the killings, List took a series of steps that showed preparation. He informed the children's school that they would be absent. He arranged circumstances that could make it appear that the family was away. He stopped newspaper and milk deliveries. He dealt with bills and financial matters. He left messages. He lowered the temperature inside the house, an action intended to slow the decomposition of the bodies. And he wrote a 5-page letter to his pastor. The letter would later become important because it offered an explanation of how List understood the situation he had created in his own mind. He connected the family's financial difficulties with what he believed was a decline in religious faith. He had come to see himself as responsible for protecting his family, and his fear of failure had become deeply connected to that responsibility. His conclusion, however, was profoundly distorted. Rather than allowing his wife, mother, and children to determine their own lives, he decided that he could determine their fate for them. On November 9th, List carried out that decision. He used handguns, including a 9mm and a .22. By the end of the day, 5 members of his family were dead. Helen List, his wife, was killed inside the home. Alma List, his 84-year-old mother, was also killed. Patricia, 16 years old, was killed. Frederick, 13, was killed. John List Jr., 15, was also killed. The prosecution would later focus particularly on the circumstances of John Jr.'s death, stating that the teenager was shot multiple times. The available information indicates that this was believed to have occurred in circumstances involving a reaction or an attempt to resist his father. Beyond that, the precise sequence should not be reconstructed as though it were known when it was not. What is certain is that John Jr. was one of the 5 victims and that he was 15 years old. The same is true of Patricia and Frederick. Their ages are among the details that make the scale of the tragedy difficult to separate from the identity of the person who caused it. They were not strangers who happened to cross List's path. They were his children. The killings transformed Breeze Knoll from a family home into the scene of a crime that would remain unsolved for years. Yet what List did after the shootings is as important to understanding the case as what he did during them. He did not immediately flee. Instead, he continued to carry out activities that appeared ordinary. Evidence later presented showed that he went to a bank and dealt with financial matters. That behavior became significant because it reinforced the prosecution's argument that List had remained capable of planning and carrying out purposeful actions after the murders. He had not simply left everything behind in panic. He was still thinking about practical matters, about money, about what would happen next, and about how his disappearance would unfold. Inside Breeze Knoll, he arranged the bodies. 4 of the bodies were placed on sleeping bags in the ballroom of the house. Alma's body remained on the 3rd floor because List could not move her. These details would later help investigators reconstruct what had happened inside the 19-room home. The 5-page letter to his pastor was also left behind. It was not a confession in the sense of a complete narrative of every event. But it became an important document because List used it to explain his reasoning. He connected his actions to the financial problems and religious concerns that had occupied his thoughts. His explanation did not change the central fact: 5 people had been killed, and List had deliberately prepared for their absence and for his own departure. Once the bodies were arranged and the immediate preparations were complete, List left Breeze Knoll. The next day, November 10th, his car was found near Kennedy Airport in New York. Investigators believed that he had left the area by public transportation. The discovery of the car offered an important clue, but it did not reveal where List had gone. It suggested movement away from Westfield and toward a larger world in which a person could disappear more easily. From this point, the case changed character. The killings themselves were no longer the only mystery. The identity and location of the person responsible became the central problem. John List had left behind a house, 5 victims, and enough evidence to establish that a terrible crime had occurred. But he had not left behind a simple path leading to him. He had planned for the period after the murders, and part of that preparation involved disappearing. The fact that he had dealt with practical matters before leaving became important later because it demonstrated how much thought had gone into the aftermath. He had considered the appearance of the family's absence. He had stopped regular deliveries. He had dealt with financial matters. He had written to his pastor. He had lowered the temperature in the house. And then he had left his car near the airport. Each action formed a piece of the same larger pattern. The tragedy inside Breeze Knoll was therefore followed by a second, quieter crime: the disappearance of the man responsible. For the people who would investigate the case, the challenge was now to understand where John List could have gone and whether he had planned his escape as carefully as he had planned the killings. The answer would eventually reveal something even more unsettling. List did not remain hidden in an isolated place. He did not live as a fugitive in constant fear of discovery. Instead, he would create another identity and build another life. But in November 1971, none of that was known. All investigators had was the scene at Breeze Knoll, the 5 victims, the abandoned vehicle near Kennedy Airport, and the knowledge that John Emil List was gone. Nearly 18 years would pass before that would change. In the immediate aftermath, however, the most urgent task was to reconstruct what had happened and understand how a man who appeared to be a quiet, religious, financially troubled family man had reached the point of killing 5 members of his own household. The answer would not come quickly, and the longer List remained missing, the more difficult the search would become. His face would grow older. His name would change. His life would continue somewhere beyond New Jersey. Meanwhile, the lives of Helen, Alma, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick had ended forever inside the home they had shared. The house could be searched. The evidence could be examined. The letter could be read. But John List himself was already moving beyond the reach of the investigators. On November 10th, 1971, the abandoned car near Kennedy Airport marked the beginning of that disappearance. The search for him had begun, but the man they were looking for would soon stop being John List in the eyes of the world. On November 10th, 1971, the investigation into the deaths inside Breeze Knoll entered a new and difficult phase. The 5 victims were known. The house was known. The circumstances surrounding the family had begun to take shape. But the man responsible was gone. John Emil List had left behind a 19-room house in Westfield, New Jersey, 5 members of his own family, and a series of decisions that suggested he had thought carefully about what would happen after the killings. What he had not left behind was a clear explanation of where he intended to go. His car was found near Kennedy Airport in New York, and investigators believed that he had left the area by public transportation. From that point forward, the case became a search for a man who had every reason to avoid being found. The abandoned car was an important indication that List had moved beyond the immediate area. But it did not answer the most important question: where was he going? There was no simple trail leading from the airport to a known destination. Instead, List had created the conditions for his disappearance before he left. The steps he had taken around the house now had a second meaning. Stopping newspaper and milk deliveries could help create the impression that the family was away. Informing the children's school that they would be absent could reinforce that appearance. Handling financial matters could give List a degree of control over what happened after his departure. Lowering the temperature inside the house could delay the discovery of what had happened. And the letter to his pastor provided an explanation of his reasoning, but not a direct path to his whereabouts. The investigation, therefore, had to move beyond the physical scene. The problem was no longer simply determining what had happened at Breeze Knoll. It was locating John List himself. In the years that followed, investigators received leads, but List remained missing. One of the greatest obstacles was his identity. He was no longer living openly as John Emil List. Instead, he eventually adopted another name, Robert P. Clark. That change would become the foundation of his new life and the central reason the search continued. For so long, the man investigators wanted was John Emil List, but the person existing in the world beyond the investigation was Robert Clark. The distinction created an enormous barrier. A search based on the old identity could not easily locate someone who had deliberately begun using another one. List moved toward a new life in the West and eventually lived in the Denver area. There, he worked, attended a Lutheran church, and developed social relationships. From the outside, he could appear to be another ordinary man living an ordinary existence. There was no obvious indication to the people around him that he was wanted in connection with the deaths of 5 members of his previous family. The transformation was not limited to a new name. List built a life that continued for years. He worked. He participated in a church community. He formed relationships. Eventually, he married again. In 1985, he married Dolores Miller. She did not know that the man she had married was actually John Emil List, the fugitive wanted for the 1971 killings in New Jersey. That fact gives the years of disappearance their particular significance. List was not merely hiding in isolation. He had established another identity and used it to participate in society. He had created circumstances in which people could know him without knowing the history attached to his real name. Yet the investigation had not disappeared. The case remained connected to the identity of John List, even as the man himself moved farther away from that identity. Time, however, worked in his favor in one important respect. People change. Almost 18 years passed between the killings and his eventual arrest. The face investigators had known in 1971 was no longer the face of the man living as Robert P. Clark. The passage of time itself became an obstacle. An old photograph could show what John List had looked like when he disappeared, but it could not easily show what he would look like nearly 2 decades later. This became especially important as the case entered the public eye again in 1989. Before that turning point, the investigation had spent years confronting the same basic problem. John List had vanished, and the identity he was using in his new life did not immediately connect him to the crimes in Westfield. The case needed something that could bridge the gap between the man investigators remembered and the man he had become. That bridge came through television. In 1989, the List case was brought to America's Most Wanted. The program offered something that traditional investigative methods had struggled to provide, a way to place an updated image of the fugitive before a very large audience. Nearly 18 years had passed since the murders. A simple photograph from 1971 could no longer be expected to represent the man accurately. For that reason, forensic artist Frank Bender created an aging reconstruction of List's face. The result was considered remarkably close to his actual appearance at the time. The program broadcast the case on May 21, 1989. What happened afterward changed the investigation. More than 200 people provided information, according to contemporary accounts, producing hundreds of tips for investigators to examine. The significance of those calls was not simply their number. After years in which John List had been absent from public view, His face was suddenly being seen by a large audience. Someone somewhere might recognize the man behind the new identity. Among the information generated after the broadcast was a lead involving a man named Robert Clark who was living and working in the Richmond, Virginia area. The name itself did not immediately announce that this was John List. Robert Clark was the identity List had used to build his second life. But the investigation had finally found a connection between the old case and the new identity. The search moved toward Richmond. On June 1st, 1989, FBI agents arrested the man living as Robert P. Clark at an accounting office in Richmond. The nearly 18-year disappearance had come to an end. Yet even at that moment, List did not initially acknowledge that he was John Emil List. He did not simply step forward and confirm the identity investigators had spent years searching for. The decisive evidence came from something much harder to disguise: his fingerprints. Investigators compared the fingerprints of the arrested man with John List's military records. The comparison confirmed what the investigation had been trying to establish. Robert P. Clark was John Emil List. The man who had left Westfield in 1971 had finally been identified nearly 18 years later. The arrest brought an end to one part of the case, but it opened another. Finding List was no longer the central question. Now investigators, prosecutors, and eventually the court had to confront what he had done and why. The physical evidence from Breeze Knoll, the preparations before the killings, the financial circumstances, the letter to his pastor, and his actions after the murders would all become relevant. But the defense would also raise another question. What had been happening inside List's mind when he decided to kill his family? The answer mattered because List's mental state would become a central issue at trial. His long disappearance had demonstrated that he could create another identity and maintain another life. But his return to New Jersey meant that the life he had attempted to leave behind could no longer be escaped. The name Robert Clark could no longer protect him from the name John Emil List. The years of separation between the crime and the arrest had finally collapsed. For almost 18 years, List had lived with the consequences of his decision while the people who knew the truth about his past searched for him. He had changed his name, moved to another part of the country, worked, attended church, formed relationships, and married again. Yet the 5 deaths at Breeze Knoll remained unchanged. The arrest did not alter what had happened there. It simply brought the man responsible back into the reach of the justice system. And now the question that had followed the case since 1971 could finally be examined in a courtroom. Had John Emil List understood what he was doing when he killed his family? Or had his financial fears, religious beliefs, and mental state affected his ability to be held criminally responsible? The answer would determine the next chapter of the case. The search for the missing man was over. The trial of the man behind the name was about to begin. By the time John Emil List was arrested in June 1989, almost 18 years had passed since 5 members of his family were killed inside Breeze Knoll. For nearly 2 decades, the investigation had been defined by absence. List was not at the house. He was not living openly under his own name. He was not waiting somewhere obvious for investigators to find him. He had become another person, at least in the identity he presented to the world. The name was Robert P. Clark. Under that name, he had worked, attended a Lutheran church, formed relationships, and eventually married Dolores Miller in 1985. To the people who knew him during those years, he could appear to be an ordinary man with an ordinary life. But that life depended on something remaining hidden: the identity of John Emil List and the 5 people who had died in New Jersey in 1971. The passage of time had given List another advantage. He had aged. The face that investigators and the public remembered from 1971 could no longer be expected to look the same nearly 18 years later. A photograph from the time of the murders showed a younger man. The person living under another identity in 1989 was older. That difference created a practical problem for investigators and for anyone who might recognize him. Even if someone had seen List's photograph, Would they recognize him after almost 2 decades? The case needed a way to close that gap between the old image and the older man. That opportunity came in 1989, when the case was featured on America's Most Wanted. The program brought the story of John List back before the public and presented viewers with an attempt to show what the fugitive might look like after nearly 18 years. For this purpose, forensic artist Frank Bender created an aging reconstruction of List's face. The image was significant because it was designed not simply to reproduce the face investigators already knew, but to suggest what that face might look like after years had passed. The result was considered remarkably close to List's actual appearance at the time. On May 21, 1989, the program broadcast the case. The effect was immediate enough to change the direction of the investigation. More than 200 people provided information after the broadcast, with contemporary accounts describing hundreds of tips reaching investigators. Each call represented a possibility. Somewhere among the information could be a person who recognized the man shown on television. The case had spent years searching through the difficulty created by a changed identity and an aging face. Now the public had been given a new image to consider. The crucial question was no longer simply whether anyone remembered John List as he had looked in 1971. It was whether anyone recognized the man he had become. Among the leads generated after the broadcast was information concerning a man named Robert Clark, who was living and working in the Richmond, Virginia area. On the surface, Robert Clark was not the name that investigators had been searching for. The name connected to the 1971 murders was John Emil List. But the investigation had already established that List had created another identity, and Robert P. Clark was the name he had used. The lead therefore provided something investigators had been missing for years, a possible connection between the missing fugitive and a living person who had established himself elsewhere. The investigation moved toward Richmond. On June 1, 1989, FBI agents arrested the man living as Robert P. Clark at an accounting office in Richmond. The arrest brought the nearly 18-year disappearance to an end, but it did not immediately resolve the question of identity through an admission from the man himself. List initially did not acknowledge that he was John Emil List. The man who had spent years living under another name was now confronted with the identity he had left behind. But the identification could not depend on his willingness to confirm it. Investigators therefore turned to evidence that did not depend on what he said. They were compared with John List's military records, and the comparison confirmed that the man arrested as Robert P. Clark was in fact John Emil List. The identity that had remained hidden for nearly 18 years was established. The disappearance was over, but identifying List was only the beginning of the next stage of the case. He now had to return to New Jersey, where the events of November 9, 1971, would be examined in court. The question was not simply whether List had killed 5 members of his family. The preparations before the murders, the actions he took afterward, and the letter he left for his pastor had already provided a substantial picture of what had happened. The more difficult legal question concerned his mental state and his criminal responsibility. List's financial problems were known. The large mortgage on Breeze Knoll, his employment difficulties, and his use of money from his mother's savings had contributed to the pressure surrounding the family. His religious concerns were also part of the picture. He had grown up in a strict Lutheran environment and had become increasingly concerned that his children were moving away from the religious standards he valued. In his 5-page letter to his pastor, List connected the family's financial problems with the decline in faith he believed he saw within the household. These details became important because they helped explain the reasoning List himself had used to justify the killings. But explanation and justification were not the same thing. The central fact remained that he had killed 5 people and then disappeared under another name. The defense would argue that his mental condition affected his criminal responsibility. The prosecution would point to the planning and organization surrounding the crime. The evidence included the preparations that List had made before the killings. Telling the children's school they would be absent, stopping newspaper and milk deliveries, dealing with bills and financial matters, leaving messages, lowering the temperature inside the house, and writing the letter to his pastor. After the murders, he had also continued to handle practical matters, including going to a bank and dealing with financial affairs. These actions became significant because they suggested a person who was capable of organizing his behavior before and after the killings. The prosecution would argue that the preparations were inconsistent with the idea that List had been completely unable to understand what he was doing. The defense, however, focused on the psychological and religious beliefs that had shaped his thinking. The issue was not whether List had killed the 5 members of his family. It was whether his mental state prevented him from being held fully responsible under the law. That question would become the central conflict of the trial. A psychiatrist who testified for the prosecution later described List as someone who could have experienced severe psychological stress while still being legally sane when he committed the killings. The distinction between psychological suffering and legal responsibility would become crucial. List's fears, beliefs, and financial difficulties could be examined as part of the circumstances surrounding the murders. But the court still had to determine whether they removed his ability to understand the nature and consequences of his actions. His long disappearance would also form part of the broader picture. After killing his family, List had not remained in the same environment. He had created a new identity, moved away, worked, participated in a church community, formed relationships, and married again. He had managed to maintain that identity for almost 18 years. None of those actions erased the murders, but they demonstrated how completely he had separated his public life from his previous identity. The man arrested in Richmond was therefore both Robert P. Clark and John Emil List. But only one of those names carried the history that now had to be confronted in court. The arrest also meant that the 5 victims could no longer be separated from the person responsible by time or distance. Helen List, Alma List, Patricia List, John List Jr., and Frederick List had remained at the center of the case, while List lived another life. Their deaths had not become less real because nearly 18 years had passed. The television broadcast had not solved the tragedy. It had only located the man who had disappeared from it. The fingerprint comparison had confirmed his identity. Now the legal system had to determine what that identity meant in terms of responsibility. The case had traveled from a quiet house in Westfield to an abandoned car near Kennedy Airport. Then across years of uncertainty, into a new identity in another part of the country, and finally to a television screen that brought the past back into public view. The search was finished. The next question was harder. What should the law do with a man who had deliberately destroyed his own family and then lived for nearly 18 years under another name? That question would be answered in a courtroom in New Jersey in 1990. When John Emil List returned to New Jersey after his arrest in 1989, the central question surrounding the case had changed. For almost 18 years, investigators had needed to answer one basic question: where was John List? Now they knew. He had been living under the name Robert P. Clark, working, attending a Lutheran church, forming relationships, and eventually marrying again. His fingerprints had confirmed his identity. The disappearance was over. But identifying him was not the same as explaining what had happened inside Breeze Knoll on November 9, 1971. The 5 deaths were established. The preparations were established. The 5-page letter to his pastor was available. What remained to be decided was the question that would dominate the courtroom. Why had List killed his wife, his mother, and his 3 children? And did his mental state affect his legal responsibility for those killings? The answer began with the circumstances that had surrounded his family in 1971. The List household was facing a serious financial crisis. Breeze Knoll carried a large mortgage. List's employment situation had become difficult, and he had used money from his mother's savings in an attempt to manage the family's problems. The possibility of losing the house had become real. Yet List had not openly told his family how serious the situation was. He continued to maintain the appearance that he was going to work normally. That concealment mattered because it demonstrated the difference between the external appearance of the household and the private pressure List was experiencing. To the people around him, he could still appear to be a quiet and disciplined family man. Inside his own thinking, however, financial failure had become deeply connected to his sense of responsibility. A psychiatrist later described him as someone who was preoccupied with the responsibility of protecting his family and particularly sensitive to failure. That description helped frame one of the central issues of the case. List did not simply regard financial difficulty as an inconvenience. His sense of responsibility was rigid, and failure appears to have carried an importance far beyond the immediate economic consequences. But financial problems were only one part of the picture. Religion was another. List had grown up in a strict Lutheran environment. He attended church and had taught Sunday school. He valued religious standards and was increasingly concerned that his children were moving away from the beliefs he considered important. In the reasoning that he later presented, financial hardship and spiritual decline became connected. The 5-page letter he left for his pastor was especially important because it gave investigators and the court a direct record of how List explained his decision. In that letter, he connected the family's financial difficulties with what he regarded as a decline in faith. His reasoning had become distorted to the point where he believed he could decide what was best for his family. Instead of seeing his wife, mother, and children as individuals with their own rights and choices, he convinced himself that he could determine whether they should continue living. That belief did not make the killings anything other than murders, but it became important in determining how List's mental state would be discussed at trial. The defense acknowledged that List had committed the killings. The central argument was not that another person had murdered the family. Instead, the defense argued that List's mental condition affected his criminal responsibility. The question was whether he had been legally capable of understanding the nature and consequences of what he was doing when he carried out the killings. The prosecution took a different approach. Rather than focusing only on the circumstances that had caused List distress, prosecutors emphasized what he actually did before, during, and after the murders. The preparations were central. List had informed the children's school that they would be absent. He had stopped newspaper and milk deliveries. He had dealt with bills and financial matters. He had left messages. He had lowered the temperature inside the house. He had written the 5-page letter to his pastor. These were not random actions. They formed a sequence of deliberate preparations designed to control what would happen after the family was gone. The prosecution argued that such behavior demonstrated planning and awareness. The same argument applied to List's conduct after the killings. He did not immediately abandon all practical matters and flee in confusion. Evidence later showed that he went to a bank and dealt with financial affairs. He then arranged 4 of the bodies on sleeping bags in the ballroom and left Alma's body on the 3rd floor because he could not move her. He left the letter behind and departed. The prosecution could therefore point to a series of purposeful actions stretching from before the murders into their aftermath. The issue of mental illness was not simply a question of whether List had experienced psychological distress. A person can experience severe stress and still understand what he is doing. The legal question was narrower and more difficult. Was List sufficiently mentally competent to be held responsible for the killings? A psychiatrist who testified for the prosecution stated that List could have been under severe psychological stress, but was still legally sane when he committed the murders. This distinction was central to the prosecution's case. His financial difficulties, religious concerns, and fear of failure could explain the pressures surrounding the crime without eliminating his responsibility for what he chose to do. The defense sought to present a different understanding. List had been shaped by a strict religious upbringing and by a rigid conception of his responsibility as a husband and father. His financial collapse threatened the identity he had built around being a provider. His concerns about his children's religious beliefs intensified his sense that the family was moving in the wrong direction. From this perspective, The killings emerged from a profoundly distorted belief that he was acting for his family's benefit. But the court still had to consider the actions themselves. List had not merely acted and then wondered what he had done. His behavior demonstrated planning. He had thought about the family's absence. He had considered deliveries. He had dealt with financial matters. He had considered what would happen to the bodies. He had written to his pastor. And after the killings, he had left the area and eventually created another identity. The prosecution used these facts to argue that List understood the consequences of his actions and was capable of making purposeful decisions. The trial therefore became a confrontation between two interpretations of the same evidence. One interpretation emphasized the internal world of a man under financial and psychological pressure, shaped by rigid religious beliefs and an intense fear of failure. The other emphasized the external evidence of preparation, organization, and deliberate action. Both sides were dealing with the same man, the same family, and the same November day. But they offered different answers to the question of responsibility. The 5-page letter was particularly significant because it connected List's own explanation with the circumstances surrounding the murders. It did not erase the planning that had taken place. Instead, it helped show how he had rationalized the decision. He had taken circumstances that were real: financial problems, fear of losing the house, concerns about religion, and used them to construct a justification for an irreversible act. The distinction between motive and responsibility became increasingly important. Understanding why a person commits a crime does not necessarily mean accepting that reason as a justification. In List's case, the financial crisis and religious concerns provided context, but they did not change the fact that the victims were his wife, his mother, and his 3 children. The prosecution's argument was strengthened by the very steps List had taken to conceal the crime and prepare for his disappearance. He had not only decided to kill his family, he had thought about what would happen afterward. The long disappearance that followed reinforced the picture of someone capable of organizing his behavior over time. Under the name Robert P. Clark, he had created a new life. He had worked, attended church, formed relationships, and married. That did not prove everything about his mental state in 1971, but it became part of the broader reality that the court had to consider when evaluating his responsibility. Eventually, the case came down to a question that had no easy emotional answer but required a clear legal one. The tragedy could be explained in terms of money, religion, fear, failure, and distorted beliefs. But explanation was not the same as exoneration. 5 people were dead, and the man who killed them had prepared for the killings and then disappeared for nearly 18 years. In court, the question was whether those facts represented the actions of a man who understood what he was doing. The prosecution said they did. The defense argued that his mental state had to be considered. The evidence would now be placed before the jury. And after years of searching, nearly 18 years of disappearance, and a trial centered on the boundary between psychological distress and legal responsibility, the case was approaching its final judgment. The courtroom phase of the John Emil List case brought the story back to the question that had been waiting since November 1971. What responsibility did a man bear when he deliberately killed 5 members of his own family and then disappeared for nearly 18 years? By the time List stood trial in New Jersey in 1990, the identity mystery had already been resolved. The man who had lived for years as Robert P. Clark was John Emil List. Fingerprints had established that fact after his arrest in Richmond, Virginia, on June 1, 1989. There was no serious dispute over whether List had been responsible for the deaths at Breeze Knoll. The central dispute was his mental state and whether it reduced or eliminated his criminal responsibility. The trial, therefore, became less a search for the killer than an examination of the mind and decisions of the man who had already been identified. The prosecution presented the case as one of deliberate, organized murder. The events surrounding November 9, 1971, were important not only because of the 5 deaths, but because of everything List had done before and after them. He had informed the children's school that they would be absent. He had stopped newspaper and milk deliveries. He had handled bills and financial matters. He had left messages. He had lowered the temperature inside the house to slow decomposition. He had written a 5-page letter to his pastor. After the killings, he continued to deal with practical matters, including going to a bank. He then arranged 4 of the bodies on sleeping bags in the ballroom and left his mother Alma on the 3rd floor because he could not move her. Finally, he left the house and disappeared. To prosecutors, these actions demonstrated something crucial. List had not simply lost control in a sudden emotional moment. He had considered the consequences of his actions and taken steps to manage what would happen afterward. The 5-page letter was especially significant because it provided a window into the reasoning List himself had used to explain the killings. He connected the family's financial problems with what he believed was a decline in religious faith. His financial situation had deteriorated. The mortgage on Breeze Knoll was substantial. His employment had become unstable, and he had used money from his mother's savings to deal with the family's difficulties. Yet he had not told the members of his household how serious the situation had become. At the same time, his religious concerns had intensified. List had been raised in a strict Lutheran environment, had attended church, and had taught Sunday school. He believed that his children were moving away from the religious standards he considered important. These circumstances became part of the defense's effort to explain the psychological world in which List had made his decision. The defense did not need to convince the jury that someone else had committed the murders. The evidence was too strong for such an argument. Instead, the defense focused on List's mental condition. The argument was that his rigid beliefs, financial collapse, fear of failure, and distorted sense of responsibility had affected his ability to understand or control his actions in the way required for full criminal responsibility. The defense portrayed the killings within the context of a man who believed he had failed as the person responsible for protecting his family. His financial problems threatened the life he had built. His religious concerns convinced him that his children were moving away from the values he believed should govern their lives. Within that distorted framework, he came to believe that death could somehow be a form of protection. That belief was profoundly wrong. But the legal question was whether it reflected a mental condition serious enough to prevent him from being held responsible. The prosecution rejected that interpretation. A psychiatrist who testified for the state acknowledged that List could have been experiencing severe psychological stress, but concluded that he was legally sane when he committed the murders. That distinction was fundamental. Psychological suffering, even severe suffering, did not automatically mean that a person lacked legal responsibility. The prosecution emphasized List's ability to plan and organize his behavior. His actions required him to think ahead. He had considered the children's school schedules. He had considered deliveries to the house. He had dealt with financial matters. He had thought about the condition of the bodies. He had written to his pastor. He had considered how the family might appear to outsiders after their deaths. And he had prepared for his own departure. Those actions suggested that he understood the practical consequences of what he was doing. The prosecution could also point to what happened after the murders. List did not remain at Breeze Knoll and wait to be discovered. His car was found near Kennedy Airport on November 10, 1971, and investigators believed he had left the area by public transportation. He then created another identity and spent almost 18 years living as Robert P. Clark. He worked, attended a Lutheran church, developed social relationships, and eventually married Dolores Miller in 1985. His ability to construct and maintain another life did not by itself establish his mental state at the time of the murders, but it was consistent with the prosecution's broader argument that List was capable of deliberate decision-making. The defense, nevertheless, asked the jury to look beyond the mechanics of the crime and consider the internal reasoning that had led to it. List had not behaved like someone seeking money for personal luxury or attempting to eliminate strangers who stood in his way. His victims were the people closest to him. His wife, his mother, and his children were the very people he claimed to be protecting. That contradiction became one of the most disturbing elements of the case. His supposed concern for the family had become the justification for destroying the family. But the existence of a distorted motive did not necessarily establish legal insanity. The jury had to separate the emotional and psychological explanation from the legal standard of responsibility. The trial also required the court to confront the fact that the passage of time had not changed the nature of the original crime. Almost 19 years separated the murders from the beginning of the legal proceedings against List. The children, who had been 13, 15, and 16 in 1971, were permanently frozen at those ages in the history of the case. Alma remained 84. Helen remained the woman who had lived with List at Breeze Knoll. Their lives had ended on the same day, while the man responsible continued living under another name. The defense could discuss List's psychological state, but it could not erase the 5 victims from the courtroom. The prosecution's position was therefore straightforward in its most important respect. Whatever pressures List had experienced, he had made a series of deliberate choices that resulted in 5 deaths. The jury ultimately accepted that position. On April 12, 1990, John Emil List was found guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder. The jury reached its decision in less than 9 hours. The verdict marked the formal conclusion of the question that had remained unresolved since his arrest. List was responsible for the deaths of Helen, Alma, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. His attempt to escape the consequences through a new identity had failed. The verdict also rejected the argument that his mental state excused him from criminal responsibility. The legal system had reached its conclusion. The financial crisis, religious concerns, and psychological pressures surrounding the case did not prevent him from being held accountable for what he had done. On May 1, 1990, List was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms. The sentence was the maximum available under the law applicable to the case at the time. The fact that the sentences were consecutive carried a clear meaning. Each victim represented a separate life, and each murder represented a separate criminal act. The sentence ensured that List would not return to ordinary life outside prison. The man who had spent nearly 18 years creating a new identity would spend the rest of his life under his real one. John Emil List as a convicted murderer. The courtroom could establish guilt and impose punishment, but it could not restore the 5 lives lost at Breeze Knoll. No verdict could return Patricia to 16, John Jr. to 15, or Frederick to 13. No sentence could give Helen or Alma another day. The trial could only determine responsibility for what had happened. In that sense, the conclusion of the case was both definitive and incomplete. The legal question had been answered. The human loss remained permanent. John List had spent years trying to separate himself from the consequences of November 9, 1971. He had changed his name, moved away, built a new life, and married again. But the courtroom brought the 2 identities together. Robert P. Clark could exist only as long as John Emil List remained hidden. Once his fingerprints confirmed who he was, the second identity collapsed. The verdict completed that process. The man who had disappeared from Westfield could no longer disappear from the history of the 5 people he had killed. Yet there was still one final chapter to come. List would spend the remaining years of his life in prison. And when he died in 2008, nearly 37 years after the murders, the case would finally move from the search for a fugitive and the prosecution of a defendant into the quieter territory of memory. After John Emil List was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms on May 1, 1990, the central legal questions surrounding the murders were finally settled. The jury had found him guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder, and the court had imposed the maximum punishment available under the law applicable to the case at the time. For nearly 18 years, List had managed to live beyond the reach of investigators. He had changed his name, moved away from New Jersey, worked, attended church, formed relationships, and married again. But the verdict ended the possibility of returning to that second life. The man who had once lived as Robert P. Clark was now permanently identified as John Emil List, convicted of killing his wife, his mother, and his 3 children. Yet a prison sentence could only address the legal consequences of the crime. It could not repair what had been destroyed inside Breeze Knoll. The 5 people who died on November 9, 1971, remained permanently absent. Helen List was gone. Alma List was gone. Patricia, 16, was gone. John Jr., 15, was gone. Frederick, 13, was gone. The passage of time could not alter those facts. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case is the contrast between the permanence of their deaths and the continuity of List's life. After the murders, he had been able to leave New Jersey and create another existence. Under the name Robert P. Clark, he worked and participated in a Lutheran community. He eventually married Dolores Miller in 1985. For the people who knew him during those years, he was not publicly connected to the 1971 murders. His new identity allowed him to function in society, while the family he had destroyed remained part of an unresolved criminal investigation. The television broadcast in 1989 broke that separation. America's Most Wanted placed the case before a national audience and presented an aging reconstruction of List's face created by forensic artist Frank Bender. The resemblance was sufficiently strong to generate hundreds of tips. One of those leads helped direct investigators toward Robert Clark in the Richmond, Virginia, area. On June 1, 1989, the FBI arrested him at an accounting office. He initially did not acknowledge that he was John List. His fingerprints ultimately established the truth. That moment was important not simply because it ended the fugitive investigation, but because it demonstrated the limits of the identity List had constructed. A new name could change what people called him. It could alter the life he presented to the world. But it could not change his fingerprints, and it could not erase the history attached to his original identity. The legal proceedings that followed also forced the case back toward the question of motive. List's financial problems had been real. His employment situation had deteriorated. Breeze Knoll carried a substantial mortgage. He had used money from his mother's savings. His concerns about his children's religious beliefs had also been real elements of his thinking. But none of these circumstances could transform murder into protection. The most disturbing aspect of List's reasoning was precisely the contradiction between his claimed responsibility for the family and his decision to destroy the people he was supposedly responsible for protecting. He had developed a deeply distorted belief that he could determine the fate of those closest to him. His 5-page letter to his pastor showed how he connected financial hardship with religious concerns. The letter did not erase the deliberate nature of his actions. Instead, it revealed the framework through which he attempted to explain them. That distinction remains important when reflecting on the case. Understanding a criminal's reasoning is not the same as accepting it. The purpose of examining List's motives is not to give those motives legitimacy. It is to understand how ordinary pressures can become distorted into a justification for extraordinary violence when filtered through a profoundly rigid and destructive belief system. The trial made that distinction legally significant. The defense argued that List's mental condition affected his criminal responsibility. The prosecution argued that his extensive preparation demonstrated that he understood what he was doing. The jury ultimately found him guilty of all 5 first-degree murder charges. Their decision established that the pressures and beliefs surrounding the crime did not remove his legal responsibility. The sentence of 5 consecutive life terms ensured that the man who had once disappeared from his first life would remain in prison for the rest of his second one. List spent the remainder of his life in prison. There was no second escape, no new identity, and no return to the community. His years of disappearance had already demonstrated how effectively he could separate himself from the consequences of his past. But imprisonment eliminated that possibility. He remained connected to the crimes for the rest of his life. On March 21, 2008, John Emil List died in prison in Trenton, New Jersey, at the age of 82. The cause of death was complications from pneumonia. His death came nearly 37 years after the murders at Breeze Knoll, and almost 19 years after the television broadcast that finally led investigators to him. By the time he died, the case had passed through several distinct stages. First came the murders and the discovery of the bodies. Then came the long investigation and the search for a missing man. Then came the astonishing discovery that List had created a new identity and lived for years as Robert P. Clark. Then came the televised reconstruction of his aging face, the hundreds of tips, his arrest, the fingerprint confirmation, the trial, and finally the sentence. His death brought an end to his personal story, but it did not change the story of the 5 people whose lives ended in 1971. If there is a lasting lesson in the case, it lies partly in the danger of reducing a crime like this to a single motive. It would be easy to say that John List killed his family because of money, but the available evidence shows something more complicated. Financial collapse was one factor. His rigid ideas about responsibility were another. His religious concerns were another. His fear of failure was another. These elements came together within his thinking, but they did not create an unavoidable path toward murder. The final decision remained his. The victims were not responsible for the pressures he experienced. They did not choose the financial problems that confronted the household. They did not choose his rigid interpretation of responsibility. And they did not choose the violent solution he imposed upon them. This is particularly important because List's reasoning attempted to transform murder into an act of protection. That idea must be rejected completely. Protecting a family does not mean controlling its members through violence. Responsibility does not give one person the right to decide whether another person should live. And religious belief cannot justify the destruction of innocent lives. The 5 victims deserve to remain at the center of the story rather than becoming secondary characters in the mythology of the man who killed them. Helen, Alma, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick were real people with lives that existed independently of the crime. The tragedy is that history often remembers them primarily through the actions of John List. Their identities became attached to his name because he forced them into the same story. But the final reflection on this case should return to the fact that their lives were not defined by the day they died. They were members of a family living in a 19-room home in Westfield. They were a mother, a grandmother, a daughter, and 2 sons. They had relationships, routines, and futures that ended without their consent. List's attempt to erase his old life lasted almost 18 years. He changed his name and built another one, but the investigation eventually caught up with him. A television program placed his reconstructed face before the public. A viewer recognized something familiar. Investigators followed the lead. The fingerprints confirmed the identity. The courtroom imposed the sentence. And prison became the final setting of his life. The case, therefore, ends not with the disappearance List once achieved, but with the failure of that disappearance to erase the past. He could change his name, but not the facts. He could move across the country, but not move beyond the consequences. He could create another life, but he could not bring the 5 people he had killed back into the world. John Emil List died in prison in 2008. The house at Breeze Knoll, the investigation, the fugitive years, and the trial became part of American true crime history. But beneath all of those elements remains a simpler and more painful truth. On November 9, 1971, 5 people lost their lives because one man decided that he had the right to make that decision for them. Nearly 4 decades later, the legal process had ended, but the meaning of the tragedy remained. The story of John List is not ultimately a story about how cleverly a fugitive disappeared. It is a story about the devastating consequences of a distorted sense of responsibility, and about 5 victims whose lives were taken by someone who believed he could decide their future. In the end, the name John Emil List could not be erased. Neither could the names of the 5 people whose lives were forever changed by his decision. By the time John Emil List died in prison on March 21, 2008, The mystery that had surrounded his name for almost 2 decades had been gone for nearly 19 years. He was no longer a missing husband, father, and son who had vanished from Westfield. He was no longer simply the man investigators had been searching for since November 1971. He had been identified, arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced. Yet the end of his life did not bring an end to the questions surrounding the case. The story of John List continued to raise difficult questions about responsibility, failure, religion, family, and the extraordinary ability of a person to separate a hidden past from a carefully constructed present. Above all, however, the case remained a story of 5 people who were killed inside their own home. That fact should remain at the center of any reflection on what happened. Helen List, Alma List, Patricia List, John List Jr., and Frederick List were not merely the 5 names attached to a famous criminal case. They were members of the same household, living together at Breeze Knoll in Westfield, New Jersey. Patricia was 16, John Jr. was 15, Frederick was 13, Alma was 84. Helen was the wife of the man who ultimately killed them. Their lives ended on November 9, 1971, while the person responsible would continue living for almost another 37 years. The contrast is difficult to ignore. The victims had no opportunity to change what happened to them. List, by contrast, made an enormous effort to change what happened to himself. He left Westfield. His car was found near Kennedy Airport the following day, and investigators believe he had continued his escape using public transportation. Then he disappeared. But disappearance, as the List case demonstrated, does not necessarily mean isolation. List did not spend the next 18 years completely cut off from society. Under the name Robert P. Clark, he worked, attended a Lutheran church, established relationships, and eventually married Dolores Miller in 1985. He created an identity that allowed him to participate in ordinary social life while concealing the most important fact about his past. The second life was possible because the people around him did not know that Robert Clark was John List. That concealment became one of the most extraordinary aspects of the case. It also demonstrated why the investigation lasted so long. Investigators were searching for John List. The man they eventually needed to find was living as someone else. Time created another barrier. The photograph of List from 1971 represented a younger version of the man who had disappeared. Almost 18 years later, his appearance had changed. Even if someone had encountered him, recognition would not necessarily have been immediate. The investigation needed a way to overcome the effects of time. That opportunity came through America's Most Wanted in 1989. The program did something that the investigation alone had struggled to accomplish. It placed the case before a large public audience while presenting an image of what List might look like after nearly 2 decades. Forensic artist Frank Bender created an aging reconstruction of List's face. The result was considered remarkably close to his appearance at the time. The program broadcast the case on May 21, 1989. Hundreds of people responded with information. One of the leads eventually directed investigators toward a man named Robert Clark living and working in the Richmond, Virginia area. On June 1st, the FBI arrested him at an accounting office. The final confirmation did not come from an admission. It came from fingerprints. Investigators compared the arrested man's fingerprints with John List's military records and established that Robert P. Clark was John Emil List. In that moment, the identity List had constructed for himself collapsed. His new name had allowed him to create another life, but it could not survive objective identification. The fingerprints connected the two identities. The case, therefore, became an example of something that had become increasingly important in criminal investigations: the ability of evidence to bridge the distance between a crime and a person who has deliberately attempted to separate himself from it. Yet the List case also demonstrated that identifying a suspect is only one part of justice. The next question was what responsibility that person carried for his actions. The trial in 1990 focused heavily on List's mental state. His financial problems were established. His employment difficulties were established. His concerns about the family's religious direction were part of the evidence. His 5-page letter to his pastor provided an important record of his own explanation. But none of those facts could by themselves determine whether he was legally responsible. The prosecution emphasized the deliberate nature of his actions. List had planned for the children's absence from school. He had stopped newspaper and milk deliveries. He had dealt with bills and financial matters. He had lowered the temperature inside the house. He had written to his pastor. After the killings, he had continued handling practical matters, including going to a bank. He then arranged the bodies and left. These actions formed the foundation of the argument that he had understood what he was doing. A psychiatrist testifying for the prosecution concluded that List could have been under severe psychological stress while still being legally sane at the time of the killings. The distinction was important because it separated emotional suffering from legal incapacity. List may have been deeply distressed. He may have felt that he had failed as a provider. He may have been intensely concerned about his children's religious beliefs. He may have constructed a distorted idea that killing his family was a form of protection. But the law still had to decide whether he understood the nature and consequences of his actions. The jury answered that question on April 12, 1990. List was found guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder. The jury reached its verdict in less than 9 hours. On May 1st, he received 5 consecutive life sentences. The punishment ensured that he would spend the remainder of his life in prison. The sentence also carried a symbolic weight within the structure of the case. There were 5 victims, and there were 5 murder convictions. Each death remained individually recognized by the legal system. The sentence could not restore any of those lives, but it formally acknowledged the separate harm caused to each victim. List's death in 2008, therefore, came after the legal system had already completed its work. He died at the age of 82 in Trenton, New Jersey, from complications of pneumonia. He had spent the final years of his life in prison, unable to return to the identity he had created as Robert Clark. His story had come full circle, but not in the way he might once have imagined. In 1971, he had attempted to remove himself from the consequences of his actions by leaving New Jersey and changing his name. In 1989, the past found him. In 1990, a jury formally established his responsibility. In 2008, his life ended while he remained in prison for those crimes. What makes the case endure is not simply the length of his disappearance. It is the contradiction at its center. List had described himself as someone responsible for protecting his family. Yet his solution to financial hardship and religious concerns was to destroy that family. He believed that he could decide what was best for the people closest to him. That belief transformed responsibility into control and protection into violence. The case, therefore, offers a stark warning about the danger of allowing one person's fears and beliefs to become a justification for controlling another person's life. Financial failure can be devastating. Fear of losing a home can be overwhelming. Religious conflict within a family can create profound tension. But none of those circumstances grants one person the authority to determine whether another person should live. The victims did not choose the financial crisis. They did not choose List's interpretation of religious responsibility. They did not choose the solution he imposed upon them. They were simply the people who happened to be closest to the man whose thinking had become dangerously distorted. Another enduring aspect of the case is the role played by the public in solving it. For years, the investigation depended on traditional police work and the circulation of information about a missing suspect. But eventually, a television broadcast brought List's reconstructed face into homes across the country. More than 200 people provided information. Somewhere among those viewers was the connection investigators needed. The case demonstrated that a fugitive can remain hidden from direct investigation while still being vulnerable to recognition by ordinary people who encounter an image and realize that something does not fit. Yet the most important lesson is not that television solved the case. The deeper lesson is that List's new identity was never complete. He could change his name, but he could not change the physical evidence that connected him to his former identity. He could create another life, but he could not erase the 5 lives that had ended in 1971. He could move away from Westfield, but he could not move away from the consequences of what he had done. And he could remain silent, but silence could not prevent evidence from speaking for him. In the end, the John List case is remembered not because a fugitive successfully disappeared for 18 years, but because that disappearance eventually failed. The man who had tried to become Robert Clark was ultimately identified as John Emil List. The house at Breeze Knoll had been left behind, but the truth of what happened there followed him across the country and through the years. His 5 victims remained the permanent center of the crime. Their deaths could not be undone, and their futures could not be restored. What the investigation, the trial, and the eventual conviction could provide was accountability. And perhaps that is the most important way to understand the final legacy of the case. Not as a story about the cleverness of a fugitive, but as a reminder that a new name cannot create a new past, and that the consequences of taking another person's life cannot simply be abandoned at the door of an old house. Nearly 4 decades passed between the day John Emil List killed his family and the day his own life ended in prison. During those years, the case moved through several different identities. At first, it was the story of a family tragedy inside a large house in Westfield, New Jersey. Then it became the story of a missing man. Later, it became the story of a fugitive living under another name. Finally, it became a courtroom case about responsibility, mental state, and punishment. But beneath all those stages was one constant fact. 5 people died on November 9, 1971, and their lives could not be restored. Helen List, Alma List, Patricia List, John List Jr. and Frederick List remained at the center of the tragedy, even while the man responsible attempted to remove himself from it. John Emil List had spent years believing that he could control the outcome of his family's circumstances. He faced financial problems. Breeze Knoll carried a large mortgage. His employment situation had deteriorated. He had used money from his mother's savings. He feared failure and was deeply concerned about what he believed was a decline in the family's religious commitment. These pressures became part of the explanation he eventually gave for his actions. But the most important conclusion is that circumstances do not automatically dictate decisions. Other people may experience financial hardship, family conflict, religious disagreement, or fear of failure without deciding that the people around them should die. List crossed that boundary. He transformed his private fears into a decision that permanently ended 5 other lives. His belief that he was responsible for protecting his family became distorted into the belief that he possessed the right to decide their fate. That was the fundamental tragedy of the case. The people he claimed to be protecting were the very people he destroyed. The preparations surrounding the murders make that contradiction even more difficult to understand. List did not simply act and then flee in panic. He prepared for the aftermath. He informed the children's school that they would be absent. He stopped newspaper and milk deliveries. He dealt with bills and financial matters. He left messages. He lowered the temperature inside the house to slow decomposition. He wrote a 5-page letter to his pastor. After the killings, he handled additional financial matters, arranged the bodies, and eventually left the house. These actions formed a pattern. They showed that the crime extended beyond the moment of violence. List had thought about what would happen afterward. He had considered appearances, practical arrangements, and his own disappearance. The prosecution later used these facts to argue that he was legally responsible for his actions. The defense focused on his mental state, his strict religious upbringing, his fear of failure, and his distorted sense of responsibility. The jury ultimately rejected the argument that these circumstances prevented him from being held responsible. On April 12, 1990, List was found guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder. On May 1st, he received 5 consecutive life sentences. The legal process had finally assigned responsibility for what had happened almost 19 years earlier. But the legal conclusion did not resolve every question. There is a difference between knowing why someone says he committed a crime and understanding why he made the decision to commit it. List's financial problems were real. His religious concerns were real elements of his thinking. His fear of failure was real. But the conclusion he drew from those circumstances was his own. The 5 victims did not create that conclusion. They did not ask to be killed. They did not agree that death was an acceptable solution to financial hardship or religious disagreement. They were deprived of their futures by someone who believed he had the authority to decide for them. The years that followed the murders created another disturbing contrast. While the victims remained permanently fixed in the history of November 1971, List continued living. He left New Jersey. His car was found near Kennedy Airport on November 10th, and investigators believed he had left the area using public transportation. Eventually, he adopted the name Robert P. Clark. He moved west and lived in the Denver area. He worked. He attended a Lutheran church. He built relationships. In 1985, he married Dolores Miller, who did not know that the man she had married was actually John Emil List. For almost 18 years, he succeeded in separating his new life from his old one. That separation is one of the most extraordinary features of the case. But it should not overshadow the people who were left behind. The victims did not receive 18 years of new experiences. Patricia did not become an adult. John Jr. did not grow older. Frederick did not grow beyond 13. Alma did not live to another birthday. Helen did not have the opportunity to see her children continue their lives. The years that gave Liz time to create a new identity were years that had been permanently taken from them. In 1989, that separation finally collapsed. America's Most Wanted broadcast the case on May 21st. Forensic artist Frank Bender created an aging reconstruction of List's face, attempting to show viewers what the fugitive might look like after nearly 18 years. The resemblance was remarkably close. Hundreds of tips followed. Among them was information concerning Robert Clark in the Richmond, Virginia area. On June 1st, the FBI arrested him at an accounting office. List initially did not admit that he was John List, but his fingerprints were compared with his military records, and the truth could not be hidden. Robert P. Clark was John Emil List. That moment carries a larger significance because it demonstrates the limits of reinvention. A person can change a name. A person can move to another state. A person can construct new relationships and present a different version of himself to the world. But identity is more than a name. Evidence can cross the distance between past and present. In List's case, fingerprints provided that connection. The same man who had disappeared in 1971 was standing before investigators in 1989. His second life had not erased his first. It had only concealed it. The trial then completed the process of bringing the past into the present. The jury did not judge Robert Clark. It judged John Emil List. The 5 murders were examined not as a distant tragedy, but as crimes for which the person responsible could still be held accountable. His years of concealment did not reduce the seriousness of the killings. His new marriage did not erase his previous family. His religious participation did not change the facts. His financial difficulties did not remove his responsibility. And his disappearance did not become an excuse. In the end, the law imposed 5 consecutive life sentences. List remained imprisoned until his death on March 21, 2008, at the age of 82. He died in Trenton, New Jersey, from complications of pneumonia. Nearly 37 years had passed since the murders. By then, the investigation, arrest, trial, and conviction had all become part of the history of the case. Yet his death did not provide a final answer to the emotional questions raised by the crime. There is no explanation that can make 5 deaths feel reasonable. There is no sentence that can return a 13-year-old boy to his family, restore a 16-year-old girl's future, or return a mother and grandmother to the home where they lived. Justice can establish responsibility, but it cannot reverse time. Perhaps the most important way to remember the List case is therefore to resist the temptation to make the murderer the entire story. John List has become the name most closely associated with the crime, but the crime was not only about him. It was also about 5 people whose lives were taken. Their identities should not disappear behind the identity of the man who killed them. Helen was a wife and mother. Alma was an 84-year-old mother and grandmother. Patricia was 16. John Jr. was 15. Frederick was 13. Their ages remind us how much life remained ahead of the 3 children. Their deaths were not the conclusion of stories that had naturally reached an end. They were abrupt endings imposed upon them. That is why the case remains disturbing decades later. It is not merely the story of a man who killed his family and disappeared. It is the story of what happens when one person's fear, pride, rigid beliefs, and distorted sense of responsibility become more important to him than the lives of the people around him. It is a warning about the danger of confusing control with protection and personal failure with catastrophe. It is also a reminder that outward appearances can conceal severe problems. Breeze Knoll looked like a large, respectable suburban home. John List looked like a quiet, religious, disciplined family man. But appearances could not reveal everything happening inside his mind or inside the household. The final lesson is perhaps the simplest one. John List believed he could end his family's suffering by ending their lives. Instead, he created a tragedy that lasted far beyond the day he intended to end everything. He left the house believing he could disappear. He changed his name and built another life. But the past remained. The television broadcast brought his face back into public view. A lead brought investigators to Richmond. Fingerprints confirmed his identity. A jury established his guilt. A sentence kept him in prison. And in 2008, his life ended there. What remained were the 5 names that should never be reduced to a footnote: Helen List, Alma List, Patricia List, John List Jr., and Frederick List. Their deaths began the case, but their lives should also be where the story ends. John Emil List could change his name, his location, and the identity he presented to strangers. He could not change what he had done. He could not restore the lives he had taken. And he could not escape the truth that, after nearly 18 years of disappearance, eventually found him. In the end, the story of John Emil List is not a story about successfully starting over. It is a story about the impossibility of starting over when the past contains 5 lives that were deliberately taken. The house became part of history. The fugitive became a prisoner. The new identity disappeared. But the victims remained, and that is where the memory of this case should remain as well.